Hello, everyone, and welcome to this timely, I would say, crucial talk. Another one of the very valuable CEFTUS talks, once more about Turkey, the very subject, the puzzle of the puzzles. I am Yavuz Baydar, editor-in-chief of Ahval News Online, an independent and critical news site and public discourse platform on Turkey. You can follow us on internet or via YouTube or podcasts. We are one of the very few free and accurate news sites left telling about the story of the country. So to the subject, as we will all agree, I think it is a country in a deep crisis, Turkey, on many levels, including its very identity, its internal divides, its polarization, asymmetry in politics, floating now in its once very stable foreign policy, adrift somewhat in international relations. Deep down, these are the symptoms or results, I would say, of the changes we have been witnessing for many years now in its very system, the core. Although much of the narrative at home and outside of Turkey focuses on personalities, especially on President Erdogan, a deeper background taking shape requires us all to turn the spotlight on just that, the system, the administrative order of Turkey. The country transitioned into an executive presidential system with a referendum in 2017 and elected Recep Tayyip Erdogan as its first president through a popular vote in 2018. This was the culmination of various political and bureaucratic forces that characterized the earlier party governments. As the new system takes root, these dynamics are now becoming prevalent in ever larger parts of the legal and institutional structure of the country. Some observers suggest or argue that the current ultra-centralistic rule goes far beyond Erdogan and his lifetime, that with the merger of various political actors that constitute Turkey's powerful right flank of politics, an unprecedented consolidation is taking form. Tonight, we are gathered to hear a deep analysis on the background stones laid for the road to super presidential system and discuss perhaps the reasonings within the ruling AKP as it shifted towards the notion of ruling through bureaucratic oligarchy. What are the main components, it's another question, of the current order? This panel will discuss in detail Turkey's new institutional structure and the direction of its evolution. For this, we have the outmost experts. The base for the talk is the broad report penned by Selim Koru, titled, as our session is, The Institutional Structure of New Turkey. A seminal work on the subject, I would say. I have not seen anything quite like this in its optics, sharpness, and conclusions. And we have Selim Koru here with us. Welcome, Selim.
Thank you very much, Yavuz Bey, for your kind words and for having me. And thank you for having me.
Selim Koru is an analyst at the Economic Policy Research Foundation of Turkey, TEPAV, and the Black Sea Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, FPRI. He writes about political ideas and is currently working on a monograph on the roots of New Turkey. He holds a BA in history from University of Wisconsin-Madison and MA in international politics and economics from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS. He has also studied for a year at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul. He's currently studying for a PhD in history of political thought at the University of Nottingham. He divides his time between Ankara and London. And we have another excellent observer of Turkey, Dr. Alexander Clarkson, who will be contributing to, maybe discussing, maybe challenging, or maybe refuting, we don't know, what Selim Koru has to tell us. Nice to have you here, Alexander.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Clarkson is a lecturer for German and European studies at King's College in London. His research focuses on the politics of diaspora communities in Europe and EU border policy. He is the author of Fragmented Fatherland, Immigration and Cold War Conflict in the Federal Republic of Germany, dated 2013. So Before moving on, I will just talk a little bit about the technical aspects of this discussion. We will have about 30-40 minutes of the presentation. And after that, I will get and collect and assemble the questions in writing and convey them to Selim, Koru, or Clarkson. So at the end of the session, after 90 minutes, we will have also a family photo. Those who do not wish to be in that photo should basically shut down their cameras. There will be an announcement about that. So let's begin. Selim and Alexander Bey will be in the cockpit, taking us through the subject. The floor is yours.
All right. Again, thank you very much for having me. So let me give you a brief sort of outline of what I'm going to say tonight. I'll basically go through the paper, and Alex and I will sort of discuss little points in the paper as we go through it, and then hopefully we'll have a discussion on some of the ideas in the paper or some of the facts we can discuss. Now, the paper is made up of two parts. The first is on the sort of really the timeline of things, how the AK parties in the past 20 years, Turkey got to the presidential system, sort of how the structure came about. And the second part really is sort of a look underneath the hub, really to look at what was going on in these institutions as this happened, and what are some of the institutional patterns really that we're talking about here. Right, and I should say again that this is one chapter in a wider work that I'm doing. So any feedback, any thoughts that anybody has, I'd really appreciate that as I move forward and writing more chapters on this. So the beginning really, the way I thought of this was I was using this old reference book. It's now old. In Ankara, back when I had an office. Right now I don't, and it's really annoying me. But when I had an office, I had this reference book on my desk on the different institutions in Ankara and how things were interrelated, which institution answered to which one, institutional budgets, who was running these places, right? It was, and I sort of Googled around and I discovered that a lot of governments actually have this, because governments are very large institutions. You need some sort of breakdown. You need to figure out how these institutions are related to each other, right? And there was a chart at the back of this book that I thought was very useful in terms of really laying out the structure of the Turkish government, the judiciary, the lawmaking apparatus, and the executive branch, right, of government. Now, the new system really doesn't have that in a functioning way. And it's debatable to what extent the old system functioned well, but the new system makes much less of a pretense of actually having three branches of government and having a division of powers. It's really about the presidency being at the center of everything, being the center of gravity, so to say, and really determining things. And the idea behind this is that the president represents the majority of the population, right? It represents the will of the people or of the majority. And that's all you need to govern. That is basically the idea behind it, right? And I point out at the beginning that there is precedent to this, right? That other systems of government have thought of this before, right? And there's a liberal tradition where you have a constitution, or sometimes in the UK it's debatable. You don't even have to have a constitution, where you have the separation of powers. You have different parts of a political apparatus and of a government, of a governing apparatus that works in tandem according to certain rules, right? Now, you have the realist tradition also. And the example I gave is the most prominent one of Carl Schmitt, who thought of this in the 20th century, right? Of the sort of the sovereign decision maker, right? Being at the center of everything and sort of shaping government, right? To put it very simply. And the question then becomes, who gets to violate the law? Who gets to violate the law repeatedly and then reinstitute what it means to be lawful or what the law is, right? These things really come up in the discussion on Turkey, right? And to the extent that you have a different kind of regime that you're talking about at the end. I mean, there is a lively discussion, and Alex will have opinions about this in Turkey about what exactly is happening, because there's been a lot of translations recently from German into Turkish about what exactly is going on in Turkey, and we can discuss a little bit more about that once we have some of the facts laid down. Now, to get into the sort of timeline of what happened, I mean, my discussions really starts in the mid 2000s, because that's when the AK Party was really sort of trying to get a feel for government. It was trying to establish itself more deeply in government and not be the victim of a coup or something and then fade away, right? It was trying to get staying power. And a very important event was in 2007, the sort of the 367 event, as it's called, right? The AK Party was, well, sorry. Yeah, the AK Party was trying to get a hold of its sorry, my computer's acting up. What I mean to talk about here is the e-coup event, which is that the AK Party was trying to appoint to the presidency its own candidate, right? And constitutionally, it had the right to do so. But the opposition, along with several high court judges, was able to prevent it from doing so, right? So what the AK Party essentially did was it deadlocked the system, went into repeat elections, right, and then was reelected with a larger margin, right? So it was able to circumvent the sort of the bureaucratic opposition to it by going to the people again and again and holding elections repeatedly, right? That's why you heard in the 2000s so many news of there being elections, right? And what happened in that year, in that 2007, that critical year, was that the constitution was changed for the presidency to be a popular office, right? The AK Party was able to institute its candidate for the presidency, Abdullah Gül, as the president. But at the same time, it said for all future presidents, they'd be popularly elected, right? So that's really the year when the presidency changed in Turkey. It was no longer a sort of an office that the majority in parliament picked, right? And it was no longer an office that was effectively subservient to sort of the senior bureaucracy. it was now an office that was kind of like parliament, except that it needed a popular election, right? In all other respects, it was still its old self. So you, for example, had to take an oath of impartiality to become president, right? And for much of those years, so from 2007 to 2014, um, there began a tension between the AK Party elected but impartial president and the prime minister, who was the effective executive, right? Um, these two people who had a history together and who actually came from the same sort of political tradition were increasingly, well, they were still on speaking terms and they still cooperated, but there was tension between them. And Erdogan basically was taking over the political party apparatus, right? And Abdullah Gül was more and more a sort of impartial, a distant person, right? And what Erdogan was trying to do during this time was to make the presidential system, make a presidential system popular in the sort of in the popular imagination, right? So in the 2010s, he was coming up with the idea of a Turkish-style presidential system, an executive presidential system. They always sort of experimented with these different ideas because people thought that the presidential system, it sounded very, in Turkish especially, it sounds very foreign, right? Um, there's semantic reasons for it. There's also, I think, symbolic reasons for it. The presidential system, for some reasons, always associated with the United States in Turkey, and the United States is not very popular in Turkey. No thanks to Erdogan. But I mean, it just doesn't work. Actually, one anecdote that I thought of writing about, but ended up not writing about, was in 2011 or so. I was in Izmir. We were holding sort of these town hall meetings. Our think tank was doing these town hall meetings on the constitutional system, because even then there were talks about reformatting the constitutional system, and I was sort of supervising people, talking to different sort of, there were tables of people talking about the Constitution and real supervisors there. And in Izmir, for some reason, there was a lot of this, but people made scenes. Whenever you asked them about the presidential system, people would make scenes. They would get up and say, oh, this is an imperialist plot of some reason. You're trying to make us think differently, which was absolutely not the intent of the project at all. We were just trying to sort of figure out what people thought about different topics. Whenever the presidential system came up, people got riled up. But yeah, there was a severe popularity problem there, and Erdogan had to work against this. I mean, there's poll results I cite here, where consistently the presidential system would poll at around 33% or so, right? Which is, I mean, it's core AK Party support, it's core Erdogan supporters. 33% or so is core Erdogan support. Sometimes it went below that, sometimes above, and it's probably not all of Erdogan's people who vote for it, but it was very unpopular. It is well documented. Anyways, when Erdogan still became president, he sort of got stuck, because in 2014, Abdullah Gül's term had run up, right? And he needed a new president. So Erdogan was sort of put up as, well, Erdogan made himself president, essentially. There was an election, went very smoothly for him. He won, right? The opposition candidate was very weak, and he won. Now, there was a lot going on in those years, in those 2000, in the teens, right? Erdogan had a placeholder prime minister who sort of wouldn't work. And Alex, you probably have ideas about that, because Davutoglu was seen as sort of was seen as the EU's man in some ways in the AK Party government, because he had good relations with the EU, right? But at the same time, yeah, go ahead.
No, I think it was Davutoglu was. I mean, it's not like he didn't irritate people.
Yeah.
I think the difference is ultimately that he was somebody who people felt they could talk to, and I think there's a crucial element here. But we'll come into the final bits of your presentation in a minute. But if we look at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and what it once was, and all of the kind of other interlocutors you had institutionally, and this isn't just actually about foreign policy. I mean, one of the things the EU system tends to do in the way it interacts with neighboring states is create all kinds of channels of communication, not just between ministries of foreign affairs, but what they often hate is the way the EU then goes directly to a Ministry of Interior or to the Ministry of Defense or to anybody else it needs to work with. And there was just the sense that there were people you could talk to. I mean, Mehmet Şimşek's role is very, very important, I think, in all of this. There were these serious people, right? And they could do an event like this one and look very serious. And I think one of the things that stays with me actually, and if you spoke to people in 2008, 2009, when things were already going in the direction that you described, was the extent to which people in Germany, for example, still spoke of Erdogan as Abnauer.
Right. Yeah.
And this is Christian democracy, really, and so on. So I think just I'll clear out now, but I'll just say that it's Erdogan's ability to do what you're going to describe in a minute was greased by the fact that externally, everybody, so many partners externally looking at this who should have known better, in a kind of a way knew better. There was always this person in the room saying, "Well, I spoke with Davutoglu and it was reasonable. It can't be that bad." Until the EU lost most of its leverage power. Interesting enough, the Ukrainians had no illusions, either before 2014 or after 2014. But that's a different story.
Yeah, I think in Western capitals especially, there was always a sense of, wouldn't it be nice? Wouldn't it be nice if this worked out? And let's give it another try. Let's have good relations with these guys. And yes, there are these these places we can hold on to, like Şimşek, and Davutoglu became then another thing to hold on to, because at the beginning he really wasn't. He seemed sort of out there. But people always wanted to sort of make different things out of the things they saw in Turkey. So Davutoglu would become like the Kissinger of Turkey or something, even though that's not necessarily a desirable thing from a liberal perspective, but people would say that in a very positive way, right? Anyways, we got to 2015 was a critical year because two elections happened, right? And the first election, I'll briefly remind people, was the AK Party for the first time lost an election, and a hung parliament ensued. Well, they failed to gain a decisive majority, and while still being the #1 party, and a hung parliament ensued, right? And
maybe additionally, 80 Kurdish HDP deputies entered the parliament in an unprecedented move, quantity-wise.
Yeah, so this was unprecedented in many ways. In 2013, the Gezi protests had happened, and the HDP was founded. And the HDP was basically the project of, having Kurdish politics move to this sort of center of Turkish politics, really, and becoming a progressive force within Turkish politics. The idea was that they would become Türkiye, right? So there wouldn't be Turkish, there would be of Turkey as sort of vague translation, right? And it worked pretty well. The HDP got 13% of the vote, which was very high at the time. I mean, it was unusual and unprecedented for Kurdish parties to get above the 10% electoral threshold, and 13% was comfortably above. This was This was a different world. And in June 2015, the AK Party looked pretty weak, right? But what was also the case was that the AK Party was in the middle of, and it turned out in the end of, a peace process with the PKK, the armed organization trying to sort of, well, for the past 30 years at the time, had been trying to, well, waging a war against Turkey for various purposes. And the HDP, being a sort of derivative of that tradition, was now approaching Erdogan saying, listen, let us continue the peace process, and we will sort of be partners with you. We will, right, bargain with you, right? They wanted a country where the majority has to bargain with the minority, essentially, right? And Erdogan's answer was no, right? We now know from people who were involved in the HDP at the time that they reached out to Erdogan. Erdogan's answer was no, right? And Osman Baydar, the one of the very prominent persons in the HDP at the time, actually said in a public event, well, he said no, and then he said, you'll see what's going to happen, right? And he says what would eventually happen was the resumption of war with the PKK and nationalist politics resuming, right? There was a second election in 2015, and through the resumption of the war and nationalist politics, the AK Party won again, right? And soon after it won, the Erdogan palace essentially got rid of Davutoglu as the prime minister, right? And moved on to really force the idea of the presidential system. It still didn't work. I mean, it was still very unpopular until the coup attempt in 2016, when the Erdogan government really had momentum going for it, right? The coup attempt was an unprecedented thing, that it created a tremendous rally around the flag effect. And Erdogan at this time was able to reach out for various reasons to the opposition nationalist party, the pan-Turkic MHP, right? And work with them on the idea of a new presidential system. And this worked very well for them, right? With the MHP, he could once again rise up above the 50% threshold. He could campaign harder in a more nationalistic way, right? Branding the other side as terrorists, really sort of establishing a patriotic bloc against a irreverent and unpatriotic bloc, and really engage in sort of populist politics in a way that's very popular now in Eastern Europe as well. And, you know, it's popular with the Trump presidency in the United States, it's popular in Brazil, it's very popular in India, right? We'll have some time to talk about those things. But essentially, that's what allowed the presidency to form, right? Once the presidency was formed, basically, you had the system of government I described above, which is that the majority elected executive essentially controls the legislature and the bureaucracy, so including the judiciary, right? He has the powers to, over the long term, really shape these institutions, right? So we have what Kemal Gözler, a constitutional lawyer, calls the problem of parthenogenesis, which I like very much. He wrote a paper on the presidential system about 2 years into it. And he said, basically, the president now makes laws that grant itself authorities, right? So you have these very strange phrasings in law of the president giving himself the authority to do X, Y, and Z, giving himself more of a budget, and there's really no mechanism around it.
I think what's fascinating about this dynamic that you're sort of describing here is the extent to which it's not the exception. And in many ways, one of the problems I have in a lot of analysis of what's taking place in Turkey is it's often placed in isolation, or it's placed in these really vague comparisons. I think it's really problematic to compare it to the United States. In the United States, it can be negative or positive, has its own particular dynamics. But I do think, even though they're less likely to get you clicks, it's much more useful to consider comparisons with states around Turkey and states that have interactions with Turkey. When I read your report, which I think in many ways is a kind of a first draft of history, I think, and a very, very useful one, because what it does is it concentrates minds on a set of systemic and structural functions and forces people to think also the extent to which if Erdogan dropped dead tomorrow, it's not so much, there's this assumption if he drops dead tomorrow, everything's back in play and so on. But you can see the extent to which you now have a set of interest groups structured around this system that would create an incentive to just put someone up in his place to keep the entire system chugging away. Otherwise, too many interests domino. And many of the debates that you outline, I mean, they're sort of relatively not new, I wouldn't say, in the Turkish context, but it's a new kind of dynamic and a new kind of debate. But they were very familiar to anybody who was actively involved in discussions around the Ukrainian constitution between, say, the Kravchuk era in '92, right through to Maidan and afterwards. Because what you had throughout the last 30 years of Ukrainian history was a fundamental tension about this question: how much power do we give the president, right? How much does Ukraine need a strong executive figure to cut through all the corruption and be strong against Russia? Is a 2014 thing. I mean, there's always a tension between Ukrainian society, but to balance all the different interest groups in Ukrainian society. And it's a debate you see in Bulgarian politics, or you really, until very recently, Romanian politics. I'm very optimistic, by the way, about Romania, because I think they've broken out of this pattern. As much because of the kind of AKP kind of equivalent is the wrong thing, but they had a state party called the PSD, right? And the PSD itself decided they didn't want to do this because actually being a member of the EU and having all these advantages, and there was all this attraction. Also, the more talented Romanian people in the scene are now drifting into the EU level. But you can see this, or look at the Vučić system, right? So there was a whole set of systems right across Europe. And I think in many ways influenced, we speak of the American influence, but we think back to de Gaulle and the Fifth Republic in 1958 and how that forms, and how he's the savior figure who comes down from Colombier de Saint-Église, and there's a war in Algeria, and the army invests this enormous sort of hope in him. And France was extremely lucky that de Gaulle, in the end, accepted democratic rules of the game. What he did was actually export French authoritarianism abroad into France-Afrique. So it's not even an East European thing, right? These are tensions fundamentally in the constitutional systems of a succession of different states and societies across Europe, right, that you can see sort of mirroring themselves and taken to its final point, maybe in the Turkish environment. So I think there's a few things to draw from the report. The first is to think that this is maybe long-term. The second, to think that this is about regional trends, right, that are actually interact with one another. Ukraine is a Black Sea country. It interacts with Turkish politics. Bulgaria, Romania, there's no question. TRNC, of course. There's all kinds of movement of ideas and people around this sphere that's often happening under the radar. Georgia, look at what's happening in Georgia right now. Of course, Azerbaijan, right? And even in some interesting ways, Armenia. And all of these countries, develop these kinds of political and social patterns. But it comes to my first question. When I read your report, one thing that I sort of was trying to find, and that anybody sort of who's worked a lot on say, Ukrainian politics or Bulgarian politics, is that you have the top level, and you come back to Maidan, right? Why does Gezi, it's interesting, Gezi Maidan happen almost around the same moment. Yanukovych falls because in the end, he pissed off too many regional power brokers, right? Of course, there was the alliance of civil society. To a certain extent, the police and security services didn't like him very much either, the military, right? They all wanted him dead by the end, right? And a lot of oligarchy interests. But what in the end kills him is the party of the regions, which is his party, loses the regions. Because in the Ukrainian system, and a lot of these Balkan, Ukraine, East European, even France, say in the 1950s, is that you have a kind of facade of power at the center, but the guy at the very top is highly dependent on a set of reciprocal power relations with people in the regions.
Yeah.
Right, that replicate the system locally. And what Yanukovych didn't understand in 2014, I think Putin in Russia is beginning to lose a grip of understanding this, is the extent to which they're actually dependent on 30 or 40 regional barons, right? So my family's home region, final point, Bukovina, Chernivtsi, right? My mom's family's home region. There's an apocryphal story. You know, what did happen is all the local notables, so to speak, you know, business people, the police guys, local agriculture interests, local intellectuals, all walked up to Papiev, who was the local sort of, you know, Baydar Bey of Yanukovych, right? And basically said to him, so the guy called Nikola Papiev, so it's Yanukovych's guy, said, "You've alienated all of us locally." The myth, I think it's a myth, was that somebody put a bullet on the table and said, you know, that's for you if you don't walk out right now. And apparently whatever happened, Papiev turned to the police chief basically went, you know, and Papiev had to walk out. You know, there's literally a video of him walking out while everybody's throwing cans at him and booing, right? So that's what broke down. What I find fascinating is, how does Erdogan work this locally and regionally? Right? What's his power vertical down to all these little mini Erdogans on a regional level that keeps it, or is there one even, or do we even have a grip on how that works?
I think part of this has to do with the way the Turkish state is structured anyways, right? In the first place, which is, it's very French, right? It's very top down in the first place. So there is that element. And then there's a second element, which is the second part of the paper, which is the Gülenists, right? The Gülenists were really the battering ram, if you will, or something more subtle, perhaps, to really get into these institutions and take them over from the inside, as the story is now often told, right? I mean, you had this, in Erdogan, you had this Islamist, right, who was, to a large extent, not really used to being at the center of government, right? Come to power in the early 2000s, right? And there are all these oligarchs in government, as you also said. I mean, there's different nodes of power in the Turkish system, right? But the Islamists didn't really have an obvious ally. And the Islamists had to define themselves against all these trends. Now, if Turkey had been, you know, somewhere in Central Asia, I don't think Erdogan could have survived. But the way he survived was to have this, the European normative dimension, you know, being very, very influential in the country. And the normative dimension saying, well, listen, coups are bad and it should be a thing of the past. We should be able to sort of move past this oligarchic system of power, right? And there's a paper in circulation, I'm sure you've heard of it, the sort of the post-Kemalist consensus, right? That there was, the argument goes, a post-Kemalist consensus in the 2000s saying basically that, well, Kemalism was the root of a lot of problems in Turkey. And the way you got over it was to have this alliance between liberals and sort of Islamist conservatives and pro-Kurdish, Kurdish nationalist elements, right? Perhaps left elements. And this was immensely useful for Erdogan because it made him less vulnerable, right? It made it very objectionable normatively for people to move up against him, right? So what happened was that you had this, a sort of stealthy oligarch of the Gülenists, right? This religious order based in the United States, but having this vast network in Turkey, right? Get into the game of the bureaucratic oligarchy, as Erdogan often refers to it, the sort of moving around within bureaucratic elites, bureaucratic as well as sort of capital elites, right? This is another sort of dimension that I couldn't go into much in my paper, partly because I'm also not an expert on it, but the idea was that Erdogan couldn't really control big capital groups, right? How was Erdogan going to sort of talk to Koç and Sabancı and try to make them work with him, right? At the time, that sort of thing seemed very implausible, right? But he was able to sort of grind them down, really, And the Gülenists were the stick that he used early on to sort of really get into these institutions. And once in late 2013, he had a falling out with the Gülenists. He had to extract them and put in people who would be more directly loyal to him, right? And the second part of the paper is sort of the way in which he had to substitute for the Gülenists, right? Which other oligarchs he put into their place, right? Because you do need to govern through oligarchs. You can't really have it any other way.
But I think it's, for me, it's fascinating because the next step would be then to take a look at that sense of this is an Erdogan system and how does it play out in everyday life? Because the manifestation of the system, I mean, I remember all those purges, and I think that's one of the things that has, I mean, there's a different discussion coming out of your paper about the way it affects relations with states like Ukraine, Bulgaria, Romania, Greece, TRNC, Cyprus, ROK, of course, the little Turkish mini empire in northern Syria, KRG, Iraq, right? There's all these states around Turkey that this is going to have knock-on effects on. But I think in terms of the extent to which the question is, it leads is if you have a power vertical that's structured around these kinds of forms, how does it manifest itself in everyday life, right? And I think that's one of a lot of the interesting studies of the work now done in Western Balkans, say on the Vučić government, or on how Borisov organizes his power vertical in Bulgaria. There's elections going on in Bulgaria right now, is exactly these kinds of questions. So you have these kinds of elite compromises and factions. And I think one of the things that is interesting is none of these states had Gülenists, right? None of them had a kind of disciplined cadre of people who could slot in and would have the discipline. Like in the Ukrainian system, what, everybody goes on about, Pravi sector, the nationalists, or in Romania about various groups, but they're all, they're all kind of, they'll follow their own kind of interests. But what a lot of that politics hinges around local loyalties, right? That you're from X region, XYZ region, you're part of a shared national environment, but there's a whole set of mixed loyalties that people have. That means they don't have necessarily that kind of discipline that the Gülenists had to re-go into that state. And I think there's an interesting question about how far Erdogan is now looking for something like the Gülenists, right? He got dependent on these guys. He can't find anyone who has that interest. And so one of the threats to this isn't necessarily at the center or at the top, but the extent to which the whole system loses cohesion because you don't have a power vertical where, you pull a lever. I do think you get that sense sometimes, right? Where you think he pulls a lever in Ankara and he expects something to be spat out in Van or Diyarbakir, doing what he wants. He keeps pulling these levers and things that he expects to happen that happened under the Gülenists. You pulled a lever and there was a Gülenist somewhere locally who would then press the button and things would work, is kind of gone. So I think there's a dimension to this about, the extent to which what can seem quite abstract is that there's an abstract top system and there's what can seem quite, what can seem quite separate, but what's happening at the top, right? And what's happening locally is there's a whole chain of communication and transmission of information coming upwards and commands coming downwards. And for this thing to kind of last in a stable way, it can last. I think you're right that there's an argument for saying it's irreversible, but the question is it irreversible and unstable or irreversible and stable? And that stability hinges out heavily on that kind of transmission of commands down and in communication upwards. So that's why I'm really interested about this, how does this work when, Erdogan, how does he communicate via, if you have a hospital building project in, I don't know, in Sandiurfa or something, or Gaziantep, and you want X to happen and he orders it. I mean, what's the chain of communication? Is it that centralized, or does he, does it do at some point, does he lose the overview over who is doing what, when, for, and how?
Yeah,
I have to intervene here briefly. I have to intervene here briefly because I think it's time to start assembling questions. And we have maybe 5 more minutes to go.
Okay.
In addition to Alexander's intervention, I think we need also talk about the conclusions, such as the new stakeholders of the power replaced by the Gülenists, and actually what had Erdogan in mind when constructing the system after himself, its future. Did he also give a lot of thoughts about the future of the system after he's gone? And does this system have a future? All these things. Can we please wrap it up so we give a lot of space to the questions? I'm sure you'll have loads of questions coming in. Selim.
Sure. Let me then just very briefly address two things. First, the Gülenist factor, right? I mean, I do think that this is the most unique aspect of the Turkey story. I mean, you look at places like India, you look at places like, Hungary or Poland, and yes, there's very similar dynamics, but the Gülenists really are different about the Turkish story. And this is why, I think the institutional destruction in Turkey was so rapid, because these guys were very effective in sort of subverting these institutions of government, really hollowing them out, and really breaking public faith in these things. Because when you talk to people about just their experiences with the Gulenis, everybody's got a story. It was so wide that the whole country really understands when the president talks about it, right? So there is very much that dimension. And yes, the people who came in their place were not nearly as sort of organized and hierarchical as the Gülenists. With the Gülenists, I mean, you knew they were always punctual, for example, freakishly so. Like always punctual, always sort of on the dot. That there was a sort of way of being that was very different about them, very hierarchical and precise, that none of the other groups have. All the other groups is, for example, other religious groups, other Jamaat in their place, right? They're very effective, for example, in the health sector, in the police, and in other places, right? Not nearly as coherent. They're not nearly as effective in subverting the law, actually. They're not nearly as good at executing specific tasks. They're not strategic in their thinking, which for Erdogan means, yes, they're not going to be as much of a threat, but at the same time, you can't get things done as quickly. Now, when it comes to the future, I make two arguments in the paper on the future. That well, I first say that it's very difficult to change the system, right? You need to actually get elected. You need the opposition to coherently get its candidate elected into the presidency and parliament, right? Get a parliamentary majority, and then turn around and basically take apart the system that elevated them to those offices. It's very unlikely to happen, right? What's more likely, I mean, if you're thinking about the sort of the democratic or the sort of positive scenario, if you will, from a liberal standpoint, would be for Parliament over time getting more and more power, right? Slowly, gradually, little fights all the time, right? Getting more power from the executive into the legislative branch of what's left of it, right? And then being able to build separations and checks into the system. That would be the sort of the liberal positive scenario. Now, if you take that aside and say, well, let's assume that's not going to happen, right? How's the system? What's the natural progression for the system? Then there's two big problems, I think. The first is the problem of succession, right? You're assuming in the Erdogan presidential system, or the Erdogan system, as Alex, I think, really puts it. I like that term. In the Erdogan system, you're assuming that the national will, or the will of the majority, will crystallize in somebody else once this one is gone, right? Once Erdogan is gone, it will magically sort of happen that another person will rise in his place and take up the mantle, right? Now, that can be problematic for all sorts of reasons, right? It could mean very subtle shifts in the identity of the regime. And it could mean also that the man of the people is no longer a man that came from the people, right? You could have a very tight sort of Politburo in which, you know, people sort of rise up and it'd be like China or Soviet Russia, for example, where this very tight circle of people who sort of stab each other in the back or engage in some sort of political thing that's not very democratic, right? And then they get all the levers of power in the media, etc. And then that sort of elects them, that makes them popular, rather than somebody like Erdogan, who, for better or worse, sort of rose up, right, in a very sort of gritty way. Now, that's the first problem, the problem of succession. The second problem you have in this kind of a system is what's often referred to as the liyakat sorunu, or the problem of, what's the English translation that of ability. So getting people of skill into the correct positions, right? If you want, you know, a hospital warden or somebody who runs a hospital should ideally know how to run a hospital, right? There shouldn't be some sort of political person that got appointed to that role, or, you know, the extension of a religious network, right? Of many of whom are now running chunks of the health system, right? Because you can have very scary sort of results from that. I mean, a middle-aged woman I was talking to, for example, was saying, well, they were talking about, you know, her doctors were talking about sort of spirits and all sorts of weird things. I mean, you get all these different stories of, you know, another middle-aged woman, a teacher I know of, was trying to get an appointment, right? And she was asking people, well, do you know anybody within the MHP who I could talk to, right? And, you know, these are, this is a perfectly legitimate way of going about a job search, or of going about, you know, a transfer placement or something in the current system. But do you really want that as the sort of way of running things? Because you're talking about the new Turkey, right, being some sort of world power, and actually you actually need to be able to have the trains run on time, right? And that endangers that. The Erdogan system could endanger that. And how long can you keep this up? How long can you have the total politicization of the system and have competency at the same time? You know, that would be the question.
Okay, it's time maybe to go through the questions, unless Alexander maybe can come in from time to
I
time.
was just going to say, even a corrupt system needs rules.
Yeah.
You can have competency and corruption. Like the Ukrainian principle, I work 6 hours for the state and 2 hours for me, right? But you need people still to think that, you know, you still need that kind of division of labor personally in people's mentality and approach to the state. And one thing, one final point, one thing what a state like, you know, you find in Serbia or Ukraine is the state is often both corrupt and responsive. Right. I'll good another good anecdote, and you'll find this across the Western Balkans, Ukraine, you know, Italy for a certain period is that roundabout when elections happen and elections matter, you know, people will tell jokes about how where the potholes or the roads were paved 3 times over by rival candidates. Right, because somehow there's a system of response. It's corrupt and not necessarily democratic, but there's like a responsive communication from top to down. You have to keep the people happy, but that requires communication. That requires a transmission belt of the people at the top need to hear what's going on below and be able to transmit orders downwards. And when that link is broken, you know, the system ceases to function.
Okay, one interesting question comes from Sinemada about the structure of the current rule, let's say, order. That is this. Thank you, Selim, for this interesting presentation and paper. I agree with you that Turkey's democratic backsliding, or even better, the gradual transition into authoritarianism started as early as in the second half of the 2000s, at a time when Turkey was celebrated in the West as the poster child of Muslim democracy. I wonder, though, whether you conflate a bit in the constitution of the presidential system with the efforts to take control from the military judiciary bureaucracy complex. Because as the chronology of events that you elegantly outline demonstrates, that there were important points along the way, such as the 2010 referendum or coalition government forming attempts after the June 15 elections. These events might have led to different outcomes should actors choose to act differently. One key factor, for example, here is, of course, Devlet Bahçeli's support to the new system, despite his earlier resistance to it. What forced him, do you think, into an alliance with Erdogan? And do you think Erdogan regrets the transition into a presidential system, given that the new system seems to work to his disadvantage?
I don't think he regrets it. And I think this is a very interesting question, because a lot of us go over in our heads, what if this would have happened? If this would have happened, would we still be in this position? Would we still be in this total polarization of the system? And would the Erdogan system still have happened? That in its essentially is the question, right? And there's many of those inflection points, right? There's many inflection points that people think about in 2015, right? What if Bahçeli hadn't been so stubborn and had worked with the opposition, right? What if he didn't spearhead the presidential system stuff? And a lot of emphasis is placed on Bahçeli specifically a lot of times on like making things happen behind the scenes. I think it's important to keep in mind that Turkey is part of a very broad trend, right? And that this is happening at various speeds and in various forms across the world, right? So this centralization of power, I think would have, and I think many people would agree with me when I say that Turkish nationalism lends itself to this very well. The being very uncritical of itself and being very sort of very outwards oriented, having this imperial legacy. These things really work well together. So I could easily imagine a scenario in which, Tayyip Erdogan was never born, but this sort of thing would still have happened. Or if, Bahçeli wouldn't have crossed over, it could still have happened in a different way, right? And I think qualitatively, this didn't even have to be an Islamist thing. It could have been a pan-Turkist revival of some sort, a dirilish, right? You wouldn't have Abdülhamit's shows. You would have, the İttihat ve Terakki shows or something along those lines, right? It would be something different, but something like this would still have happened.
I think it's also, I'm always a fan of the longue durée. I think for me, but this is just simply from the perspective of, say, EU-Turkish relations or Europe-Turkish relations, or say, the diasporas, is how much already you can see of these kinds of impulses or pressures in the late 1970s and early 1980s. I mean, there is the canon, the coup of 1980 is this. I mean, we all know that this sort of fundamental caesura, and that the many of these. I mean, it's like all of these. I always like to use when I teach students the notion of Lego, right? That they're all that you have all these pieces on the floor, and a leader, there's a particular historical juncture when they're assembled in the advantage of a certain faction because the constitutional checks and balances and controls break down. But you have to end up with the pieces on the floor at the start. And I think there's also an interesting question of when did the pieces land on the floor that were then assembled by Erdogan? And I think there's a strong argument for saying that a lot of when does this start? You could even like push it backwards to the late 1970s, early 1980s as a moment in which the constitutional or the basic power balance in Turkey falls out of whack and never stabilizes, and he stabilizes it in this way.
There's actually a paper, I'm going to cite him again, by İlker Aytürk, who looks at the far right in the 1970s and sort of looks at that time period as a breaking out period, really. And the way you can distinguish between the far right and the center right really is the emphasis on identity there. And that in that paper, that's very clear, in the sense that the center right in Turkey, Demirel, Özel, and these people were really primarily about economic development, right? They didn't really question the sort of liberal and neoliberal paradigm of their time very, very much. Catching up with the West was really about replicating it to that extent. And yes, you had that identitarian dimension to it, but that was never really, it was inappropriate to talk too much about that, right? Whereas the far right, which is the Islamist far right and the pan-Turkic far right, right? They had it the other way around. They were like, well, yeah, you need to get into all this technical stuff. You do need to privatize things, etc. But what was really important for them was the identity bit, And this really is, I think, how everyone thinks about the presidency still is, well, once I have power accumulated in this office, and once I have finished establishing my office, right, everything will just flow. People power will just, it will come up from the bottom, from the very bottom. It will swirl up and crystallize into this office. And this office will then, crystallize the power and sort of grow the country, right? That really is the model that he's got in mind. But what he doesn't really think about enough, I think, and what anybody thinking along these lines has to sort of grapple with is, as that power flows down, right, you need intermediaries, you need institutions, and you need people to run those institutions, right? Even if you're okay with a majoritarian system, you still are going to need all those barons, right? And that's going to mess with your utopia of majoritarian Sunni Turkic Turkey, right?
That, in a way, perhaps responds to the question of Daniel Seligson, but I will still give it to you. You have to govern through oligarchs. You can't do it any other way. Why is it so?
Somebody's got to do the cash money. I mean, sorry, ultimately look, I hate, I have come over time, and maybe that's simply from a kind of a more Eastern European or West Balkan or whatever point of view. I sort of have come to, even though I frequently use it, loathe the phrase oligarch, right? I mean, every political system, whether a functioning constitutional democracy or not, has a concentration of power and a business power trade union nexus of various kinds. And even in systems without, with trade unions that are under the cosh, you still have informal means through which workers can express their discontent in various ways to spend, whether they suffer the consequences of that later is another question, but it still flares up. So, I mean, what is in all, a Ukrainian oligarch is also, the term is so overused. So there's always going to have to be a bunch of people in a political system, either democratically legitimized or not, who act as power brokers, who act as transmission belts, who act as a kind of a node within a power system that connects the business, private, industrial sphere with the state, and with the legislative democratic system, and with the security and services in the military. We find that in every system. The question is does a system have enough, not just constitutional, but societal checks and balances to ensure that no individual becomes too powerful? And this is where we come back to these Eastern European paradigms, these paradigms, I think, in North Africa. Iraq is very interesting in this context in Algeria, but the pouvoir, how, look at what happens to Bouteflika. The system was like, in the Turkish sense, they had to have a corpse right? Because they were afraid that if they removed the corpse, the whole presidential structure that was set up, and there's an interesting parallels there as well, would sort of implode, and that's what they're still struggling with to this day. But so in all of these different systems, you have these people who act as power nodes, as people who act as interlopers. So I mean, I don't know. Yeah, systems will produce these kinds of figures, and the question is have you got the constitutional checks and balances to control them? Ultimately, you know, somehow again, it's about the transmission of communication of problems from below in different sectors of society, the concentration of power, and the ability of those at the center of power to communicate the orders back down, right? And without these figures, without these kinds of intermediaries, however much we end up hating them or loving them or whatever, that chain breaks, that link. You can see this in Russia right now, right? Russia would be in better shape if it was actually an oligarchy. Right? I would claim if there were actually oligarchs, right, who could tell Putin in his dream palace, you know, what actually is going on, right? But he's actually bent the whole system in a way in which that form of transmission of communication, what's happening on the ground to the top, is broken. I would claim, although this is contested. So yeah, you need these people, right? We used to be in Britain, we call them business associations.
Okay.
I mean,
yes.
What often happens, very shortly, very briefly, what often happens is we have these two ideals, right? One being a rules-based society. This is a term that gets thrown around a lot. Societies where there's rules and, you know, it doesn't really matter who you are, right? And then oligarchies or these people where societies that are totally politicized and ruled by elites, etc. I think neither one of those really exists in very pure forms, and B, neither one might be desirable, and C, it doesn't even matter because you can't really, it's a spectrum, right? You can go closer to here or closer to there, but you can't really have any sort of idealized system.
On succession, asks my colleague Amberin Zaman, you drew parallels with Russia and China and said an inner circle, a politburo, would quickly find a successor. But unlike China and Soviet Russia, if not present-day Russia, you have a very strong party machine. Without Erdogan, the AK Party would likely collapse, would it not? And isn't the most likely outcome instability, chaos, and possibly violence? And speaking to Alex's previous question about how the center maintains control over the regions with the weakening of the parliamentary system, which is the vehicle for patronage in and control over the periphery under the current presidential system, isn't part of the problem also that there's a far narrow or circle of people around Erdogan feeding at the through causing deepening discontent in the broader party? Selim Bey?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we have with the AK Party is, yes, it started with an idea of the sort of, you know, a mainstream conservative Muslim country, right? The Christian conservative example in Europe transplanted into the sort of Islamic and Turkish dimension, right? And then what happened over time is that the Erdoganist or the cult of personality really took over. And the AK Party is essentially what the ruling sovereign needs it to be, right? It's the extension of his cult, right? And yeah, it would be very, very difficult for it to exist without him, right? When you go to the AK Party, a lot younger people are different, but a lot of the older people or the people who were in the AK Party for a longer time are pretty disillusioned, I think. It would be very difficult to maintain it without the cult of personality. Of course, you could just sort of pass on the cult of personality to the next person. Now, the family doesn't work because for various reasons, you know, nobody in the Erdogan family really was able to sort of fill the shoes or give the feeling that they might be able to in the future, right? But you could have, I think, different people step in and take over the coalition that Erdogan built and continue on with it. Because these people do cohere pretty well. When push comes to shove, I mean, I was on the street on the night of the coup, and there were Islamists and pan-Turkic nationalists, people who have very deep ideological divisions, who had no problem at all cohering together and being in the kind of unit, right? And it was very natural in a way that you don't see with the left ever, right? So this is very much possible, I think. I forgot the second question.
I would add as a caveat, I mean, again, if you take a look at the Algerian example, it shows that, you know, once some form of presidentialism is entrenched and too many vested interests have, you know, their entire power structure is basically structured around somehow having this person at the center that acts as a kind of dispenser of ideas. You know, it's a vacuum still with Tibune, right? It's you know, the system just kept going because they had to kind of keep that system in place because everybody was too afraid of unpicking it. So it's entirely plausible that you could have, you know, Erdogan in a hospital on a drip, you know, for a long period of time, or some faceless vacuum after him. And it's just sort of carried along by inertia. And as long as the opposition can't unite properly and take somebody out of Erdogan's power coalition, that whole thing could actually float along for quite some time in a very unstable fashion. But it's also not worth, I mean, for me, the question is simply, is this going to be a stable system or an unstable system? But it's there, right? But it could continue even with very weak leadership. I mean, we've seen that around Europe recently.
Mm-hmm. And maybe a follow-up question would be one by Sarah Glynn. Erdogan is talking about further constitutional changes. Have you thoughts on what he's aiming for next and what impact this could have on the ability to organize any form of opposition? Would this raising of the or proposal of a new constitutional changes, series of changes, would it be a reflection of what he deems unsatisfactory for the future of the system that he's built? Or what? Selim Bey.
I think it's the natural continuation of the thing he's building. I mean, it's always a little bit more and a little bit more. I mean, with the constitutional change.
In this case, there might be some components missing. What components?
Yeah, so I mean, with this constitutional change, there are some things, for example, that his government needs to get done before 2023, before the elections. It might be that they rig the electoral system just right in a way that would suit them in the 2023 elections, right? That's going to be important. I also suspect that they're going to change small but important symbolic things, right? About the role of religion in society, the content of education, right? The way some of these institutions work. And there's going to be also important changes made to some of the problems we were talking about on efficiency, right? I don't think the Erdogan government is happy with the efficiency of government at this point. They're going to want to make the judiciary much more efficient, for example. They're going to want to provide better service for people in general. I do think that they're going to try to do that through these changes, right? Because you do need to reform these systems. So there are going to be, I think, it's just going to be a very large package of that kind of change. And change is also on a more political level. You need to be promising people something all the time. You need to be able to say, I know things are bad right now, but this is why they're bad, and this is how I'm going to fix it. And one of the lessons of Erdogan's politics is always to have something like that, to always go to the people with something like that and say, you know, those before me have built a system that that is harming you, and I'm here to fix it, and I'm going to fix it in this way. And you say that over and over again, and you go deeper and deeper, right?
I also think there are a number of unresolved territorial issues. I mean, I don't think TRNC, I don't think for a number of reasons, partly because, I mean, I don't think the Turkish Cypriots want it, really, any kind of change in their status. So I think they like to play that card repeatedly to make the Europeans nervous. But there is, for me, looking at this question of the territorial borders of Turkey towards Syria and towards KRG. And I don't know if, obviously, this is. I don't think they themselves know what to do with them, those territories. I think that's kind of clear as well. They're just sort of stuck with them. But there is that. I mean, that opens up a whole can of worms and a whole field about what Turkey's borders should be, or where they should be placed. That is, I think, also an open and interesting question that I don't think Erdogan wants to answer at this moment in time. But it's certainly something that could be a unifying aspect later on down the line for anyone who wants to play that kind of territorial card of aggrandizement, or I mean, it's there. They control these territories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the Erdogan's politics is nothing if not gradualist, right? Very gradualist, very deliberate. The way he usually thinks about things is he sets himself up in a way that would allow him to take a further step once the opportunity is there, right? I mean, obviously, territorial expansion would be very nice and, you know, would be very pleasing to the political base. And in a broader scheme of things, that would be very desirable for just ideologically, right? And obviously, you can't do that right now, not officially. But northern parts of Syria are effectively governed through the interior ministry in Turkey, right? Yeah. I mean, northern Cyprus is getting into deeper and deeper into the Erdogan system, right, in various ways. And this is like, this is the way that Erdogan approached institutions within Turkey for the past 20 years. It was a matter of time, right? You let things mature and then take their course. And the nationalist and the sort of worldview that he represents is very prevalent in the world right now, and people do find it very easy to sink in and work through it.
I think the Turkish intelligence services knows how. I think there's Damascus is a lot weaker. I think I don't think it's going to collapse tomorrow, and I think Russian support for all of these projects, be it Libya, Libya, and again, right, Libya, CAR, Sudan, that whole network of belt of chain of bases and influence, is very conditional. It's not popular in Russia itself, right? A Russian leadership could withdraw from those places without a lot of damage. I don't think they're going to do that anytime soon, this decade, right? But if we're thinking decades or 2 decades down the line, you know, it's not, that's, you know, Russian, it's not a vote winner in Russia, put it this way, to be there, you know? And so, I mean, I think the question is what does Erdogan, I think it's an open question, but what does Erdogan want with these damn things? And what would be the, again, if I was thinking in terms of, because of what I do, the European, but there's also a European dimension related to these borders. Because in fact, if he extends Turkey's borders, he's extending the EU's customs borders, which is, there's a whole interaction there that nobody really knows what to do with either, right? So there's this other thing, I think, that's also very interesting that's worth pursuing in terms of where the system is going.
I think we have space for 2 or 3 maximum questions, but before that, I will, Selim, please, you had something to say?
Yeah, just very briefly. I think it's very significant that these movements in power are far-right movements, right? I mean, if they're not center-right, and this is the difference, right? What if you had a referendum in Turkey, I believe, on sort of should Turkey govern the northern parts of Syria, or should Turkey govern, I don't know, northern Cyprus or something? A lot of times the answer would be no. You know, we have no business there or something. There would be, just as it was with the presidential system, people don't instinctively sometimes want these things. They need to be sort of guided into it and taken into it slowly, matured into it, right? That's the Erdogan way of thinking. And that's what you would do if you were Erdogan and thinking about acquiring these territories and acquiring greater say in the world by you wouldn't ask your people about this, and then people like Putin and Erdogan understand this, I think, very well.
Okay, two more questions. I said we have about 9 minutes to go. My colleague Susan Gusten asks, could, again, speaking about the future of this system, could Süleyman Soylu, the current Minister of Internal Affairs, fill those shoes and keep the coalition going, the loose coalition of power?
Right. So Soylu is it appears to be the strongest candidate. He, yeah, I mean, notoriously he tried to resign, right? Or he pretended to, he basically tendered his resignation publicly, and then the request was denied, basically, right? Erdogan said, no, you can't resign. We need you, right? Which is what he was going for. But the thing is, Süleyman Soylu is independently popular, right? So when Erdogan's son-in-law did the same thing, he was granted his wish and he was able to resign, right? He was let go because he was deeply unpopular within the party ranks and within the governing bloc, within the 50% of the population that votes for Erdogan. He was unpopular. And Süleyman Soylu isn't. He is pretty popular within that 50%. He was able to be there. And he stands out among the cabinet and among party politicians in general as being well-positioned.
I think Mark Galeotti has a really good, for the Russian situation, a really good way of reading it, in which he says, ultimately, when Putin goes down, the key question is, who are the 10 suits in the room who negotiate the state afterwards, who gets what in the state afterwards? And he says, actually, for example, Navalny's strategy is to become such a pain in the backside that even if they don't want him in that room, they have to bring him in the room to keep people under control, right? And maybe he can leave her open in the system. So I think the interesting question is for you, Soylu is one of the 10 suits in the room, but what are the other 9? You know, so I mean, that's something worth thinking about as well.
Okay, I think we have the final question and then we'll conclude there by Erhun Kula. The question is, if Erdogan lost power, once Erdogan loses power, do you think that the opposition would be able to form a lasting government? And I would also add an additional question to this. Lately we see, chosen target more increasingly so as the main opposition CHP by Erdogan, at least by his rhetoric, as he leaves the attacks to the HDP, to Soylu or the MHP flank of the power structure. What sort of place does Erdogan envision for the opposition in the future of this system, in addition to the Erhun Kula's question? And then we can conclude there.
Right. So I wrote a paper on this last year on sort of Erdogan's opposition strategy. And what is effectively has happened is that the opposition, within the opposition, there's polarization. And that really is the most important polarization in the country, right? There's the opposition, there's the governing bloc and the opposition bloc, and those are roughly 50% each. It fluctuates. And then within the opposition, you have polarization between the nationalists and the leftists, right? And the Kurds, the Kurdish movement is on the left, all the way on the left, right? So for the opposition to be able to govern and to be able to cohere, you'd need to bridge that divide and really be able to contain that polarization in a stable way. It wasn't possible in 2015, right? They weren't even able to start negotiation. They weren't even able to start talking to each other, right? The nationalists just said no. Now this time around, there's different nationalists. And the big question for the future is, will these nationalists be able to talk to the left and the Kurdish left, or perhaps the Kurdish right? The sort of Kurdish politicians, leftist politicians, right? And it's very unclear.
I mean, maybe a final point for me, the way these things can suddenly swing and unexpectedly, I always think back to, I mean, one of the great anecdotes of 20th century European history is when in Portugal, the regime collapsed and there was a military coup to bring democracy. One of the senior socialist leaders who helped guide the country out of the crisis was in jail. And when the paratroopers opened the door, he thought they were going to come in to shoot him. And they actually said, no, sir, we want to bring you in for the negotiations, to be one of those suits in the room, so to speak, to work out the succession. So the hope of the opposition is that it builds up enough of a base that the AKP probably can't negotiate around it, and that might even have to take Demirtas out of his jail cell and stick him in that room where the future of the state's negotiated. But I mean, you'll know that far better than I would in terms of whether that's possible.
The problem might be, of course, that going into the opposition, well, once you have, if you're assembling the 10 suits in the room, right? Or if the 10 suits in the room sort of gravitate towards that room, right? It'll probably be opposition nationalists.
Yeah.
Probably won't be leftists, right? And you will have new allies within the nationalist bloc. And all of a sudden, these people aren't opposition anymore, right? And you have the same problem that you had before, which is a substantial part of the population is being left out of governance. They're being branded as enemies of the country, right? Huge chunks of the population, maybe 20%, maybe 30% of the population is bunched into this category, right? So it depends on what gets these 10 people together.
All right, folks, I think this is time to conclude. As with many discussions about Turkey, such a massive moving target, any discussion, however enlightening they are, they leave you still confused. I hope this one leaves us still confused, but on a higher level. So thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Selim, Koru, for this great discussion or presentation about the institutional structure of Turkey's current power. And I think it's time, after thanking you for thanking everybody who patiently listened us, and thanks to all sending us questions. And it's time for a family photo. Those who wish to be in that family photo, please stay, and others who do not wish to doing so can basically shut down their cameras. And I think it is time for that now. I hope we are through. Yes, I think I got the message that we are through. Thank you again, and hope to see you soon in another enlightening Seftus talk, still about Turkey and its story. Have a good night.